Hello, beautiful people. Thank you for joining us again on Generational Archives. And I am Dr. Raina J. León, and I'm here with my mother, Dr. Norma D. Thomas. Mommy, how are you going to introduce yourself today?
Well, I'm happy to be here, and the topic is of the day is near and dear to my heart.
So let's get to that topic. We are going to be talking about my grandfather, Grandpop, and that Edward Llewellyn Thomas. But before we start about talking about Grandpop, you had a check-in question. So what was your check-in question?
Well, the second question would be how would each of us describe my father just using three words or
So
three phrases?
for me, the three words would be gentle, it would be supportive, and it would be creative. That would be my last one.
Oh, you changed
I
that.
changed it. We talked about it beforehand, but I changed it.
So mine would be family oriented, strong work ethic, and brilliant.
hmm Would you also have added stubborn?
Well, I think a lot of people would describe my father as stubborn. They also would describe him, one of his nicknames was Scrooge, so he could pinch a penny until it screamed. But that had to do with as much maybe being frugal as being the father of many children. And so that was out of necessity as well.
And so I was just thinking about, sometimes, we talk about who's the most stubborn in my family and our family, and I'm always at the bottom of that list.
Yeah,
I'm not
right, Raina.
stubborn at all. And Poppy's usually at pretty high up there. You're not as high as Tito is, but I want to say that as I remember Grandpop, he probably would have beat us all. Yes, I'm absolutely sure of that too. So, what do you want to tell us about Grandpop today?
Well, first, I want to start out with a poem that I
Yes,
wrote concerning my father,
I love it when you start with a poem.
and it's called Saint Daddy. I knew my father was a good man. I knew my father as a provider for his children. I knew my father as a soft spoken man, toward his children anyway. I knew my daddy was a fixer of anything mechanical. He was a brilliant and kind man, poor but a millionaire in spirit, and I loved him. But when he died, I heard my father described as a good friend to many. I heard my father described as the best of siblings. I heard that my father took care of a lot of people and possessions, and he preserved the heritage of black folks by taking care of their burial ground. Saints walk among us all the time. Too
Mm,
often we do not recognize them until they are gone.
mm,
And my dad specifically got described as a saint by my sister's ex husband's mother, who came to my dad's funeral.
mm.
And after the funeral, she said, I knew he was a good man, but I didn't know he was a saint.
Oh wow.
And that was based on what everybody said about him at that funeral.
Mm. Yeah, I think that that's so poignant, and I love that you shared a poem. I love when you start us with poems because it allows us to travel with you in this transformation of memory into the creative holding of a person within the breath, because I always come back to the poem as this container of breath, and the breath is what unifies us. It still is so vibrant and so vibrantly alive. So, what else do you want to share about Grandpop? I should share this. Why do I call my Grandpop Grandpop? So, because you obviously called Grandpop Daddy. My father is Boppy, so I think it was just this kid thing, combination of cultures and terms, that grandfather, granddad became Grandpop because my father is Boppy. So, I think that's where it came from.
Well, my first thing I want to say is different than many of the other people we've described in our journey on this podcast. His original documents like his birth record and death certificate seem to be accurate. So this is one of those rare experiences where the names of the people are right, the birth dates appear right. The informant on his death certificate was me, so I hope we did get all those relationships right. And again, this is not typical based on what our experience has been along this journey. So he is the son of Albert Thomas and Alverta Bird, Alverta Thomas. And he's from the Uniontown, Pennsylvania, was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and is from the line of Thomases that go back to at least Josiah Thomas, Jacob Thomas, and was from that line of the Thomas family. And Uniontown, we talk about the different sides of the family. So his grandfather was Walter Thomas. Walter Thomas's father was Philip Thomas, and Philip Thomas's father was Josiah Thomas. And so land was always important to my family. When I was born, he was in the military, and we've talked, I think, previously about the fact that it was a year after his discharge that he and my mother came to Uniontown. They did bring me to Uniontown to stay with my grandmother, but then they came to town for a while, lived with his grandfather, my great-grandfather, and then he built the house that we grew up in, he and my grandfather. So he was always a person who was industrious. I say could fix anything, although I told him that story once when a bus that he had converted to a motorhome, the engine blew apart. And I said, "Oh, you'll just fix it." And he said, "No, Norma, I can't just fix this engine. It is blown apart. We have to get a new engine." But I was always convinced that he could fix anything. There was nothing he couldn't put together, take apart, and repair.
Well, and he did. I have all these memories of our broken toys and my brother breaking a remote control car, for example, and bringing it to my grandfather and him fixing it. And it might have had to do some jerry rigging there, but fixing it. And the same thing, we were this is where we were spoiled, because we had those cars that you could ride, like actually ride in as kids, which is so irresponsible. I don't know why you bought us those things. Like, we didn't have licenses. We lived in the city. Like, this was not a good idea. But anyway, we had these cars, and one was blue, one was red. Can't remember which one it was that broke. But I want to say Grandpop fixed it once. And then after that, whatever it was couldn't be fixed.
Well,
but the idea
what
that
happened with at least one of those cars is we gave it to my uncle Jim Pete for his grandchildren, and I think they rode it once and went right into the street with it, and that was the end of them driving in that car. And one of them sat in my dad's basement for a very long time. I think it was the red one, was in the basement for a very long time. But again, back to how I described him. My father only went to the 10th grade. We previously told the story of what happened that sparked his leaving the public school system. But my dad could help us with complex math, or algebra 1, 2, geometry, trigonometry. Never had it in school. And I would say to him, "How can you help us with what you never learned in school?" And he would say, "It's just logical." And I would say, "There's nothing logical about trigonometry and algebra 1 and 2. What is logical about this?" But he could help us with those things. His work ethic was clear. My dad worked with my grandfather for years in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. They would come in on Friday, and he would have to leave again on Sunday. And he worked for a company called the Crane Company, which manufactured tubs, sinks, toilets. And he described taking the hot molten parts for the toilets and the tubs, and he showed us the scars where it had gotten on his skin. and left marks. And so this was not easy work. This was factory work, and they lived away from their family. At some point, well, I should also follow up that when he came in on Friday, we still didn't see him because he worked either at George's Motors, which was an auto body place, or he worked for Truccio's coal yard. So him and my grandfather would be dealing with coal. So they worked even when they were home and supposedly relaxing and seeing family. So constant work.
Well, and you have to note around like the preciousness of meat in your house and the guarding of my grandmother over the meat with the eyes and mouths of children wanting to descend and to eat all that was there.
Well, now when people get a steak, an individual can get a whole steak. It's still amazing to me that you can go in a restaurant or you go in the store, you buy the steak, and the steak is just for you. But when we were growing up, the steak was for the whole family. And so my mother had to guard that my poor dad could get a piece of this steak because the rest of us would be eyeing it, that we would want to eat what was left for him. So he worked very, very hard. It was either, I thought it was 13, but then I looked back on something I wrote that I wrote 14 when he decided that the time had come for him not to continue to go to Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And he decided that he was going to get a job in town because he said his children were getting older and that he needed to be in town. My grandmother, I know a lot of people were really upset with him because that meant my grandfather was continuing to go to Newcastle. He continued to do that till he retired. And they wanted Daddy to continue to do that so he would travel with Picky, and my dad said no. And he started his own, he worked for George's Motors for a while, and then it burned down. And Daddy said, I was bringing all the work there anyway. And so he started his own business. And in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, that was unique for a African-American man to have his own business.
Yes. But was he being paid all the time? It was being paid through trade sometimes.
Well,
some chickens.
Again, we had the barter system.
Right.
So Daddy would fix a car and then we'd get our hair done, or so there was those things that, and since he did his own business, he did his own books. So you don't really know how much my dad made or didn't make because he did the books himself. So he did, whatever the tax man, I don't know. I mean, hopefully he gave the Caesar what was Caesar's, but
well,
I would suspect not.
Well, I also love, too, a part of the story is like he had the shop, and then he also had clearly a love of cars, so much so that there were many cars right outside the door of the house. Some that had been, perhaps a goal of repairing them sometime in the future, but never happened. And so when he transitioned, they had kind of sunk into the ground. But some beautiful cars, so much so that, too, that, everybody in the family, when they needed a car, had a car. And that changed people's perception of you in town, Mommy, right?
Well, it's something we took for granted because there was always a car. Now, nobody knew that those cars were wrecks when my dad got them and he fixed them. So we had a beautiful Cadillac, but, it was a $200 totaled car that Daddy worked on, and that's how we could drive it. So as long as I could, when I learned to drive, I had a car. And, that's a blessing and a curse because, of course, I wind up driving everybody to every place they had to go. But I had a car. My friends didn't have cars. And so that was, again, things that you took for granted. But because of that, people also thought we were rich because we had these cars that, again, people didn't know were junk cars. So they often would break down, but because my dad was a mechanic, they would get fixed very fast. I drove a Bonneville once and I hit the turn signal and it fell off in my hand. And I said, Daddy, what is this? And he said, oh, just stick your hand out the window. That works. Just do hand signals. And it's like, no, fix this car. So, my dad had the skills to do not only the work in the car, but work in the house. And just to reinforce what Raina said, when my dad transitioned, we had at least one motorhome in the yard, because we had a big yard. So one motorhome in the yard, two boats, we had a truck, we had several cars, and my dad was a collector. So the cars were filled, the motorhome was filled with stuff that we had to clean out and sell. Luckily, for the most part, we found the titles or were able to obtain the titles. But it was funny. I do lectures on hoarding behavior and talked in Uniontown about our yard that had all this stuff in it that we didn't think twice about, because, again, we had this big yard, so cars were on blocks or sunk into the mud. And someone at the event said, oh, yeah, I used to walk through your yard to go to school. So it was a little embarrassing that with me describing our yard, they knew what I was talking about, because we had all these vehicles that were there, but that was part of my existence.
I want to go back a little bit to the facts too, because you said all the men of like Grandpop, and then it was Picky, Albert Thomas, his father, and then Walter Thomas, his father. But I don't want to lose sight of the women in our family as well. So Grandpop's mother being Alberta Bird Thomas, Granny, who was one of the early, we focused on her for one of the early episodes, and then her mother, Annie Rubottom. And also don't want to lose sight of Walter's wife, who was Julia Thomas. And we've just talked about the Thomas Cemetery and in the previous episode, and she is buried there next to Walter. So we are not just made up of the men who may have also controlled the land, but also our women, the matriarchs, all of our peoples should be remembered and recounting.
And I'm hoping at some point we can talk more about them. I wanted to talk about my dad specifically because we had talked about my mom.
Yes.
And so I wanted to make sure that he got equal focus, because he was for
remarkable.
us, he was always the stabilizer. He was the person who never seemed to get mad at us. So when we would do something wrong, he would just say, you did something wrong. I mean, he never hollered at us. He was a big believer that men should not ever strike children, so he was not one for corporal punishment. He was the even-keeled person that didn't seem to get upset. I mean, I've seen him upset, but it was upset at other people, often poor workmanship around working in the garage. But he was not a person that would raise his voice at any of us.
Although there is a story of my Aunt Stacy getting into something and him going up and over a hill, and he was going to get his daughter out of this situation.
Oh, yeah. He went in. She called and said she was being held captive by somebody, and he goes busting in the house with his gun. And they said, well, Mr. Thomas, she's not being held captive. So my dad was like my mom. You don't mess with the children.
No.
So, yeah, my dad could definitely, he had a temper, but it was never focused on us at all. And I can remember him teaching me how to drive and almost running into a tree. Now, my mother would have almost had a heart attack screaming at me. My dad said, Norma, you almost ran into that tree, is what he said. And it's like, yeah, I know, I was ran into the tree. But he never, you never got this harsh word, this discipline. He left the discipline to my mother. That was just something. And he got mad at your dad once because your dad, you have an older brother and sister that when we were dating, your dad brought to the house, and they were in the yard and somebody gave them meat and they were vegetarians and nobody knew this. And so your father disciplined, the two children. And my dad, I walked in the house and he had lost his mind, because he said nobody should ever discipline children, and and it was his yard and his family, and my mother's holding him back saying, but those are his children. And and I witnessed this, and I said to my husband, never, ever, ever say anything to any children in front of my dad, because that's the maddest I've ever seen him in my life. And he loved your dad, but so he was, back to that description of being very family oriented.
Yes.
That was him. That was definitely him.
So I also remember this one story about the document, the marriage certificate of Grandpop and Grandmom. And I remember you telling me that in conversation with him, he had said, "Oh, you'll never find that. You'll never find that birth certificate. That marriage certificate. We decided to get married, crossed a bridge over to Alabama, got married there. Don't even kind of remember the date really." And I know you found it. I know I found it. I found it on online. Found them on the rolls, the marriage rolls.
Well, I found it back in the day that you couldn't find this stuff online. So when my mother died in 1986, I said, "Well, Daddy, you're eligible for the Social Security death benefit, which is like $250. And he said, "Well, I don't have the marriage certificate. You will never be able to find it." We got married when he was in the military station in Columbia, South Carolina, which is where he met my mother. And he said, we went over this bridge and went to this county in Alabama. So I looked to see where that could possibly be, what county, wrote to that county and got the marriage certificate so he could get his Social Security death benefit. And I said, "Daddy, never underestimate what social workers can do, because I have to do this for people in terms of finding their documents so that they could be eligible for benefits." And he was in shock that I could find this marriage certificate. So I have it. I guess it's one of those documents I should probably upload to Ancestry.
It's already up there. It's up there.
Okay.
So,
well, yeah, nowadays all that information is there. But again, back when I started this journey, it was really interesting that it didn't take that much to find that death certificate. So never
marriage certificate.
Marriage certificate. I don't know why I keep saying death certificate, but marriage certificate. And I guess that points to a factor: never believe that you can't find something. It may take a lot of work, and much of this is now online, but not everything is readily accessible.
And whenever you find it, print it out and save it and share it with other people, ideally.
Right.
And I also think that if you need help in doing your own research, talk to a social worker. Apparently, that's a specific
because
skill set.
we do have to help people find their documents. A number, and many times that's people who are members of the African American community, that they just don't have access to these birth records and these identification records at a time when people want you to have this stuff to be able to even vote. That there are people who just don't have it. And so one of the roles of a good social worker is to be an advocate, but also to be able to be good researchers to help people find their documents. And, there are others who can help along the way. But yes, I was able to find, because he would often say to me, you can't, when it was time to apply for my mother's, to see if he could get higher benefits after my mom died. And he kept saying, "Oh, you can't do that. That won't happen." And when I was asking him to start that process, he procrastinated. And one day he finally went to Social Security to apply for benefits under her name and realized that he had missed. There was a time when Social Security would go back retroactive, and then they stopped doing that. And he said to me, he called me at work, and he never called me at work. So I just knew somebody died. It was just, some tragedy. And he's like, "I just went down and applied for getting Social Security benefits under your mom, and they told me I couldn't get retroactive benefits." And I said, "So how many years have I been telling you to do the same thing?" And he said, "Well, you should have tried harder." Because he was stubborn. So that he had this belief that it wasn't possible. And again, Never, never think about the fact that you can't get benefits that you might be entitled to.
Mm.
I'm working with my sister now to get benefits because she was based at Camp Lejeune,
Yeah.
and she keeps saying, "Oh, I can't get anything. I'm not on that list of illnesses." And I'm like, "Could you please just register anyway?
Mm.
Maybe they'll expand the list of ailments that qualify people. The
Mm-hmm.
more people, get on Facebook and other groups talking about this, because you were on that base for a while.
Mm.
And she also has a lot of chronic problems. So
Mm.
never not do something because you talk yourself out of it.
Mm.
We are our own worst enemy sometimes in talking yourself out of things.
So, is there anything else you'd like to share about Grandpop today?
I also want to mention that he was a DJ in
Oh
his life,
yeah,
and Raina found that really surprising. But he had an extensive
I
record
had no idea.
collection that his children got into, I know, at some point, and he lamented that we destroyed all his records. But he was a DJ in town. So he was a man of many, many, many talents, a person that did not go far in school, but was brilliant nonetheless, as were others in his siblings.
Mm.
And people walk among us that are very, very, very much community oriented. Between him and my mother, they were very, very involved in community without talking about the things that they did. And again, sometimes it's when they're gone that you realize how much people did depend on them. He became the caretaker of Clearview Cemetery when we could not bury easily my Aunt Doris in the cemetery. She was buried there, but the family couldn't go in the cemetery the date that they went to bury her because it was so overgrown. And he became the caretaker for 10 years out of his own pocket, lifted stones, hired people to wrench up stones that had fallen, and tore up many a tractor trying to clear as much of that cemetery as he could. And he wasn't paid for that for the
Mm-hmm.
10 years that he did it. So he did a lot of work in the community that, again, and he was friends to many people. He took care of a number of people that we didn't know about.
Mm.
We didn't know about. I didn't know that he was, for example, paying the taxes and the utilities on a property that was owned by his grandfather and then his aunt and uncle, that he paid that property tax and he kept the utilities on for years. And when he died, that stopped because I could not continue to do that on a property we would never own. But he did it, and
Mm.
knowing he would never own that property. But he did it because it was family land.
Mm.
And he wanted to make sure it did not get lost for taxes, which unfortunately eventually happened. So he did all that work, and nobody knew he was doing all that work until
Mm.
he was gone.
So, if you were to say that you do or have this quality from Grandpop, what would it be?
Well, I know we have the strong work ethic
Mm.
that no one ever had to tell us to get up and go to work, and we are fiercely independent. We get that both from both sides. We're family oriented people, and we are community people.
Yes.
We give back. So I think all those things we get from my father.
So I'll claim all of those things. I will also say that Grandpop was a puzzler. He really liked
Oh yeah, he
jigsaw
like.
puzzles.
But we
So
didn't know that either until he died.
that is
Because
not true. I used to watch him
did you
do
really?
puzzles. Yeah, he had a whole desk, a drafting table right next to the couch, which had these massive puzzles, and I would watch him doing them.
Well, and I
So,
guess I didn't pay attention until we're cleaning out things, and then
mm,
downstairs there was one puzzle that was still together that I actually polyurethane and put in a frame. So that's in my house. That's the one
and
that
I think it's
sits
poignant
next to the
to
clock.
note around what's missing from that puzzle.
Well, when we brought it back to Philadelphia, there were 2 pieces missing. And my father and sister died within 24 hours of each other. So there's only 2 pieces missing. They are right next to each other. And I always thought this symbolized the 2 missing pieces in our life. But I didn't notice that he did puzzles
Oh, yeah.
until downstairs there
Yeah.
were boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of puzzles, that carloads of puzzles that we took to Goodwill when we were cleaning out the house.
Yeah, I remember that so fondly, that it's something that with my husband, Mateo, when we were first coupled before we had a dog, we would get puzzles and we would do puzzles together every night while we were having our dinner together. And it was part of our, like our beginning couple practice.
He
And
also liked trains.
And and trains, absolutely. And when later in our lives, when a friend gave me a massive amount of those Brio trains, I think about him often when I'm playing with my kids in those trains. I love trains. So.
He loved airplanes too.
Yep.
He was a paratrooper.
Yes.
He got training, so he jumped out of planes.
A perfectly good plane.
And when he came to my house in Southwest Philly, we lived near so close to the airport, you could actually see the people in the plane when the plane was descending to go to the airport.
It's very close to our house.
He would sit on the front porch with watching the planes. He loved it.
Yeah, and so I invite you all to think about, as you describe, as you remember your beloveds, to think about what you have inherited from them. What is generational? And that's at the root of this podcast. Generational Archives is also about that piece that is generational. It's generational to be community oriented. It's generational to be creative in this way. It's generational to have a compassion for folks that doesn't have to be proclaimed. This is generational. What is generational for you? So thank you all for joining us once again for Generational Archives. If you dig the podcast, like, subscribe, support us on Patreon, share the news, email us, all the things. We are available to you. And as you provide some feedback, we are eager to create episodes in response. We're on the YouTube. Every now and then we go live on my TikTok at Raina J León, and we post on Instagram under Storyjoy Inc., which is the company that we have together, as well as under my name, Raina León, on Instagram. So see you on all the interwebs, and thank you again for listening.
We look forward to reading your comments. Ask us questions about family history. If there's information that you want that we might have, please let us know. And we are open to crafting future episodes based on what you would like us to bring forth. So thank you.
Bye, y'all. Find your
Bye.
generational.